Hello, my name is Guy Morris. I'm the founder of the Author Event Network. Author Event Network is an association of amazing authors from Seattle and Portland who share space at events, festivals, and fairs to engage readers, to build their platform, and to sell signed editions of our book. We're here today with a member named Andrew Sweet, who is an author of fantasy and science fiction novels. And welcome, Andrew. How are you doing?
Hi, doing great. Thank you.
I appreciate you coming up today.
Yeah, thanks.
Well, Andrew, tell us a little bit about let's start by giving us a little information about your book series, The Reality Gradient. Where does it take place? What is it about? And where does that name come from?
Sure. Wow, that's a lot. Okay, so it takes place in the far future in the year 2185. And the book spans about almost 100 years into the next century. The Reality Gradient, the name itself, comes from the fact that each novel in the series is progressively farther from what we would consider our normal world. So like we have this existing world that we live in where I'm talking to you right now. And as you know, there's this whole concept of the metaverse that's currently being explored by big tech. So by the time you get to the last novel in the series, we're kind of dabbling into that metaverse, so to speak. It's not called a metaverse, because I wrote the book before the metaverse was, the term was coined, but that's where it goes.
Excellent. Well, what inspired you to write this particular series?
The series started, I'm glad you asked that. I go back and forth about it because there are elements of this book that have come from my notes. And 10, 15 years ago, I had a dream that involved angels and demons and a lot of stuff that you won't find in the book. but the general storyline and the way that the characters interact with each other was all there. However, I wasn't sufficiently motivated to actually do the work until 2016 when Trump was elected, and then I saw that and then we had the social justice protests that started up again, and I realized that there was in the social media feeds that I monitor, there was a lot of misunderstanding of what it means of the impact of some of our past as a nation, some of the decisions that we made in history. And as you may know, that critical race theory has become a big, kind of big scary term. So I wanted to kind of take some of our history and twist it into something that people could consume and understand a little bit, and also present it in a way that we could see that that these things that have happened are not impossible, and there are aspects of human character that kind of drive us to certain injustices. And so that's what the book, my first book, Models and Citizens, is actually about. Although it's highly entertaining, I don't like to proselytize it. I don't like to read books that do that. So there's definitely a lot of good, believable, lovable characters that are in the book that the readers can relate to.
What would you consider the underlying themes or premise that flow throughout the series?
Yeah, that's a good question. In this series, I'm focused on the normal person. That's who I follow. If you look at each one of the books that I've written, even Liberia, Goddess of Worlds, which is the third one, the last book in the trilogy, it says Goddess of Worlds, and there's a good reason for that. But the characters are all people that you know. They're not like massive people with massive political influence. They're not corporate leaders, with the exception of a couple of things in there, but I'll talk about that later. They're normal people, and they're people existing in a world that's post-climate change, that the Earth has moved on and created a kind of equilibrium, so they're dealing with the fallout from that, post-population decline. But there aren't any, especially in the first one, Models and Citizens, there aren't any big heroes. These stories are based in the future, but they're not your typical, the little guy overthrows and some big evil empire type of thing. They're really real people living real lives, trying to deal with their consequences and what happens to them along the way.
Well, tell us then a little bit more about those characters. Tell me about your main character, the protagonist that really drives the story forward. Tell us a little bit more about that character.
Yeah, sure. This one, for Models and Citizens, and really this character follows throughout the entire series, although less in the later novels. the main character is Harper Rawls. She's a college student, and she has just returned home. The novel opens with her returning home from college for a break after graduation before she pursues her career, as so many of us have experienced. And as she's preparing to embark on her professional career, over the summer, her parents die in a tragic incident. So this derails her. And what I really like about this character is how normal she is, and how she really is like a lot of us, and that she hasn't really thought about those big questions about society that science fiction attempts to address until she's cast into a situation where she has to. And the reason that she ends up having to face the larger world is because her mother, who's died in a tragic incident, was actually having an affair with somebody that's with a genetically altered clone, which is where the name Models and Citizens, the models part of that is a genetically altered clone, where her mother was having an affair, and she discovers this after her parents die. And so that thrusts her on, that propels her into this world that she didn't know, that she had never really thought about. But as we peel back the layers and as you progress through the novel, what you realize is that this world has been affecting her the entire time, even if she wasn't necessarily actually fully plugged into it.
You mentioned climate change, post-climate change in your explanation. Tell us a little bit about what that looks like in your vision within the book. How does the world look at that point?
Yeah, sure. So the world, I did a lot of research on that. I looked at projections, scientific projections for the next century almost, just to kind of see what would happen, and because I've always kind of been interested in what would the impacts be. So a lot of Texas is underwater, and a lot of Louisiana and Florida, those consequences are happening. I don't touch as much on the tumultuous effects of the aggravation to weather patterns, but so really there's one scene in the novel where Harper is reminiscing about the past, and because she grows up throughout the end of this event, and the ocean is creeping up. She lives in League City, Texas. So the ocean is creeping up to her back door, and as it creeps, I don't know if you know this, well, you probably do, but as the water saturates the soil, it starts killing the trees, and it kills the plants. And so there's a tree that lives in her backyard that she watches as time progresses, and she watches it slowly die. And the reason I put that in there is because that happened in Galveston. We had a significant flooding event maybe 20 years ago now, and it killed all the trees. And so you had these forests of dead trees that they just weren't alive anymore after the water receded, just like that fast. So sorry, go ahead.
Interesting. Well, tell us a little bit more about the relationship between normal people and these models that you spoke of. Are the models, seen as second class? Are they? Is there a bigotry of any sort? So how do they get along, and where did they come from?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. Thanks for asking. There's a prologue in the first book, Models and Citizens, that kind of gets into that a little bit. And around the year 2150, in response to the declining population, because we have an economy, even a global economy, that requires positive population growth, and we hear about this a lot in today's newscasts. So in response to that, in order to shore up the existing lifestyle, we start producing clones. We being two large corporations. There's Prescient Technologies or Prescient Pharmaceuticals, and then Emergent Biotechnologies were the two main corporations in the book. And at first, they're not cataloged, they're not tracked or anything. They're just created, kind of pumped out, and sent to work sites. So they're contractor for hire, and there's a legal gray area. But eventually, around the year 2160-ish or so, there's what's called the Madison Rule that goes into effect that basically says, hey, it's too complicated keeping track of these people, so we have to start marking them, and the corporations have to start making sure that they keep track of every single one of these clones. So they basically come in as kind of like, I don't know, I pulled that bit from the United States history, because for a while there we had, indentured servitude as for in a lot of the what we call now slave states. Before we had black people as slaves, and then we had black people that were also indentured servants. Eventually, when the legislation was passed, that took away the indentured service status of a lot of black people. So a lot of people that were here to work for a period of time, suddenly they were indentured for life, or their indentured servitude was for life. So that same thing happens in Models and Citizens. At first they were individuals could potentially models could potentially integrate into society if they were lucky, but eventually they were marked and they could no longer do that.
Interesting. Now, do these models have any sort of expiration date, or do they live a normal life, or how do they look from that perspective?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I wasn't expecting that. Yeah, so good for keeping me on my toes. The models don't really have an official expiration date, but there's a usefulness factor involved, and eventually they stop being useful, and there's no retirement plan for models who can't do the work that they were created to do.
Okay. And
they're owned by corporations. So eventually the models get sent back to the corporations, who also no longer have a use for them, except for their constituent proteins and the components of their body that they can then potentially recycle to make more models. So what it's, in a very clinical way, we call them reclamation facilities in the book. There are reclamation facilities all throughout the United States where models are sent once they expire to be reclaimed for their constituent proteins that then be used to produce the next generation.
Wow. Okay, that's a lot to cover. What do you tell us a little bit more about other than Models and Citizens? I know you've written other books, some of them fantasy. You've got the Southern Highlands book. Tell us a little bit about some of your other books and kind of what are the themes and premises of those.
Sure. Yeah, I'd like to touch on that. I mentioned Library Goddess of Worlds as the end of this series. And in this book, what I really love about it is I geek out on artificial intelligence in that novel. So in the novel opens with this entity, this person that is creating a world out of nothing. And it turns out that this person is really just playing a video game. But you learn this in the first chapter. It's really just playing a video game in the first chapter. But that event and her being noticed doing that sets a series of events into motion that causes, how should I say this? That causes the creation of an artificial life, so to speak, like an entity that suddenly exists in these virtual worlds, because in this book, by the time we get to this book, there are virtual worlds, like the metaverse exists now. So, but there are creatures in the metaverse, or things in the metaverse that nobody knows where they came from. And so that's what this book, Library Goddess of Worlds, is about, is figuring out where one of these individuals came from, and and it's a multiple storyline. So it follows that, and it also follows another character, and they intersect toward the end of the novel. So I call this one my really weird book, because it's got a lot of concepts to keep track of. This Southern Highlands is really pretty straightforward. It's a space opera. And it's about a trade, what essentially breaks out to be a trade war-ish between Earth and Mars. Mars is rhodium rich, and Earth requires rhodium, and all the uses that we're finding for rare chemicals like rhodium are growing daily. So at this point in time in the future, which happens right around the time as Libera, actually, that trade becomes interrupted, and the main character, the protagonist, April Sallow in Southern Highlands, has to remedy the situation because she's in charge of the trade between Earth and Mars. She embarks on a voyage to Mars to try to fix the problem, but it's complex because on Mars, the person that's involved, that's directly in charge of controlling the Martian end of trade, is her former lover. And so for all of us out here who have exes, you might imagine that doesn't exactly go very well.
Right, right.
And hence one thing leads to another, and then you've got a space armada and black holes swallowing ships, and it just gets out of hand really fast.
Primarily because of the love issues between the two.
Yeah.
It kind of, boy, that's a little scary to think that the whole world could be held captive by a bad relationship.
It isn't it? But if you think about it, really, that's kind of the sum of history right there. Is being captured by one bad relationship after another.
Well, that's a little bit true. We look at how the Ukraine war kind of is turning out. It's really sort of a bad relationship problem. Now, in this one, do you carry through the theme of models existing in that world as well?
There are models, but it's not a significant part of the storyline, and that's why I didn't include it in the series, is because it kind of falls away a little bit from the underlying concept.
Okay. What is your process for writing? How do you kind of develop your storylines, and what kind of research do you do? How much reality do you kind of bake into? You mentioned a couple times that you models, or you basically use a form of history or piece part of history in order to kind of replicate it into the future. Tell us a little bit about your process and how you go about doing that.
Sure. Well, it helps if you're obsessive, so that's useful. I tend to take an idea and then I latch onto it and dig and dig and dig and dig, and that's what I did when we were started to see the uptick in social justice. I started looking at, well, do we really have a problem with police brutality? And then I dug a little bit further. And I said, oh, well, we do, and there's a whole history here of why we do, and then I just take one idea and I drill down and drill down and drill down. For the social aspects, I've always been interested in philosophy, so a lot of the philosophical ideas are stuff that I've just picked up over life. But to tie into the historical events, I do an asinine amount of history. In fact, in one of my novels, I've kept track. One of my later novels, I kept track of the number of references, and I'm up to like 100 references or something. I'm not going to put them in the book, but that's how I do that. For the science, I have a degree in applied computer science and bioinformatics from George Mason University, and I've also worked hard on my own to do modeling of different types of computer simulations like cellular automata. I've tried working on neural networks, things like that. And I've always been fascinated with the hard problem of consciousness. So I walked into that part pretty well grounded and understanding. So if you read the books and you see stuff that's happening in there, you could say that that's consciousness related. It's all been researched. It's not stuff that I don't make up stuff for this. I take the pieces and then I weave them together.
Excellent. Well, and I think that there's a real power in that. I think for science fiction, some of the best science fiction we've ever had has been based on true scientific principles and theories and research, and it allows us to really kind of indulge in that more. And I know that I'm a real personal believer that research can make the difference between a good book and a great book.
I would agree.
How much do you mentioned some of your own personal expertise? How much do you kind of try to kind of project your expertise or your field forward in doing that? Particularly in consciousness. I know I do research in artificial intelligence. There are companies right now working on artificial intelligence from a consciousness, specifically in consciousness, creating artificial consciousness. How do you see that pattern kind of evolving over the next couple of decades?
Oh, that's fun. Yeah, so I see us having. I think we're having a problem with our egos right now with regards to consciousness, because I think we want to believe that as humans we surpass everything, and there can be nothing greater and nothing that can do things better in any capacity. But I think eventually what we'll learn is that as consciousness emerges, there are going to be things, because computers are ones and zeros and they do things a certain way, and humans are very analog, that there are going to be things that computers do better and that humans do better, and there will always be a divide of some sort. So what we're discovering now is that a lot of the stuff that humans could do, computers can do better. But there's still going to be stuff that humans will always be able to do better.
Do you think that'll change with quantum computing?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I think with quantum computing, I think I think but I haven't had a chance to play around with quantum computing nearly as much as I have with the ones and zeros. So we'll see.
Well, you were one of the earlier members of the Author Event Network. And so tell us a little bit about, I know you wrote to me recently about your experience in terms of sales and other things in that network. Tell us a little bit about your experience with the network. What do you like about it, and where do you want to see it go?
Oh, absolutely. I love being able to get face-to-face with people and talk to them about my stories, because as you may be able to tell, and I know I speak really fast and I kind of jumble through things sometimes, that's because I'm excited. I love the subject matters that I'm talking about. And so being able to share that excitement with someone, looking what Author Event Networks does is it puts you in front of your customer or otherwise interested party, somebody who likes what you like. So it's really easy to talk to people that way. And then if they buy a book, that's fantastic. And what I've learned and which usually people do, or often people do, I was able to double. Sorry, I was able to double my sales of novels last year just by signing up and going to Author Event Network's events. And I didn't really go to that many. I think I went to maybe 3 total last year, and I was able to double my sales.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so I'm really excited about this season and getting in front of even more people and just geeking out with people about science fiction. And hey, if they buy a book, that's awesome too.
Well, I know that one of the events you guys are signing up for in the Portland area, you're one of the new members of the Portland chapter, is a UFO Fest. So I think you're certainly, your sci-fi will be, your geek will get on there.
Yeah, exactly. That's going to be a blast.
Well, if people wanted to find your books, where would they go to find your books?
Okay, yeah, my first one, Models and Citizens, you can get an audiobook, or you can get it on, all of my novels are an ebook. Anywhere ebooks are sold, you can pick up any of my novels. You can get them on Amazon, you can get them at Barnes & Noble. You won't have a problem finding them. Just do a search for Andrew Sweet, and I'll come up in Google.
Excellent. What last thing would you like to leave with your audience in terms of what makes your book special and stand out?
Yeah, I would say the hope. I do write dystopian science fiction, so it seems kind of ironic to say that, but really it's, if you pay close attention to the characters and the psychological and emotional transitions that they make, they are gravitating toward, they stay with it, they fight the good fight, they don't always win, but they always stick to it. And that's something that I think is a message that we just need to keep in mind especially in today's tumultuous world.
Thank you, Andrew. It's been a pleasure to speak with you. I appreciate you coming up, and I'm looking forward to going to more events with you this year.
Thanks, Guy. It's been a pleasure to be here.
We want to also thank the Bremerton Public Access Television, who have been gracious to us to let us use their studio, and with a wonderful staff. Author Event Network interviews will broadcast on Saturdays at 5 p.m. Comcast Channel 12 and Astound Channel 3. Thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you on the next broadcast. Take care for now.